Hi everyone, this is a lecture on craft arts. It covers the content of Chapter 12 in Understanding Art, 11th edition. The learning objectives for this chapter include explaining the traditional distinction between craft and fine art, as well as challenges to this separation of categories. Use appropriate terminology for materials and processes related to ceramics, glass, textiles, metal, and wood, and discuss the qualities and purposes of works of art representing forms associated with the craft tradition. Okay, so we're getting into some sticky territory with trying to separate craft and fine art. Art critics and historians once had clear answers about the difference between art and craft, and now, however, the perception of the relationship among functional objects, craft materials, and techniques and works of fine art has changed. So just think about for a moment your original definition of art that I asked you to come up with when we first started the course this semester. Probably it did not include anything about the object being used for a practical purpose or a utilitarian function. So that is normally in the past how we separated things. Crafts were something that could be used, had a functional component to them. So the division between fine art and functional objects is linked to the historical and cultural context in which the work was created. So some artists view the distinction between art and craft as artificial, limiting, and even denigrating, meaning like it lowers the value of them. Others embrace the distinction, though the line between art for art's sake and art for utility's sake is sometimes blurred. As you will see, there is no clear definition, but if you were just trying to maybe wrap your head around like what has been the definition, I think we could say, art for just purely aesthetic value versus something that you could actually do something with. So the chapter starts with this example. This is an ancient Greek crater, which would have been originally used to hold wine. It has a lot of beautiful aesthetic qualities. These paintings, which we would possibly consider the painting a work of art, the object itself would be a work of art. But at the time that it was made, the person making the vase would have maybe been considered a craftsperson, maybe the person doing the painting an artist. Throughout history, the concept of an artist has changed. It didn't even exist for part of humanity's history. And then really in the Renaissance is when we get that idea of that individual artist, who signs their name and is famous for, their particular individual style. So even our concept of what art is versus craftspeople has changed over time. So maybe take a moment and think about, can utilitarian objects be art? Does, the idea transcend, craft and function? A lot of us talked about, art being about an idea. Can that, go above and beyond what form it takes? So let's look at another example. This is a piece by Miriam Schapiro. It is certainly something that we would maybe label as an art object. It is in an art museum, but it is comprised of objects that have traditionally been considered something utilitarian, and the fact that it's made of quilts. It has embroidery on it. It has aprons on it. These are things that traditionally have been forms of expression for women. But certainly an artist has found a way to make it more of a fine art piece. So this is a great example of how today the lines between art and craft are very, very blurred. So let's look at ceramics, and this is my area of expertise and my area of passion. So I'm going to try to dial it back and not get too crazy about it. Ceramics refers to the art or process of making objects out of baked clay. So we have up on the upper right hand corner a clay deposit. It is something that is found naturally occurring in the earth. Clay is primarily alumina, silica, naturally occurring minerals, and other organic matter. Humans have been making things with clay from the beginning of our humanness. There are places on the planet where the only way that we know humans have lived there at a time is because we have found evidence of their pottery. Little broken pieces of pottery are called sherds as opposed to shards. So we've found pottery sherds and know that that's how some people have lived there. Clay has been used as a writing surface. The lower left-hand image is cuneiform. Ancient Sumerian culture used that as a form for like a surface for writing and recording information. And then clay has also been used just as a building material. The lower right-hand corner shows you some bricks made from clay, and that's how a lot of structures have been built and also are still built today. Clay is patted or pinched and rolled into forms, and that was done long before the invention of the potter's wheel. So those are what we call hand building techniques: pinch forming, coiling, and slab building. And then I'll show you examples of wheel throwing here in just a moment. In order for clay to be durable, hard, waterproof, it has to be exposed to heat or fire. So on the left-hand side of the picture, there's an electric kiln. That is today how a lot of firings are done with clay in order to make them permanent. So we have two examples here of coiling techniques. Maria Martinez and her husband were a pottery duo, and they are famous for their black on black technique. They were from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso in New Mexico, and you can see that the form itself is very symmetrical. So this was made by just rolling coils of clay and blending them together as they're stacked on top of each other. And the same technique was used by Cheryl Ann Thomas for the image on the right, but you can see it's a much more organic form. She kind of embraces the organic nature of it, and you can see a lot more texture that she's incorporated into her forms. And so both of these are what we would call vessels, but certainly one is potentially more functional than the other, but both of them have the qualities that we would use to label something a work of art as well. The pottery wheel is also a tool for making vessels, and it's called throwing on the wheel because of the original way in which the device was able to be rotating. So we have forms that are made by the pottery wheel spinning, and then Jennifer McCurdy's form that she threw on the pottery wheel, then she altered it by cutting into it and carving some spaces into it as well. So one of the ways that you can do surface decoration with clay is with something called glaze. And that is a glassy coating applied to the surface of a vessel, and it makes it non-porous. So if people want their ceramic work to be waterproof or food safe, they have to glaze it. And the surface characteristics of glazed pottery can be glossy, matte, smooth, textured, monochromatic, polychromatic, simple or complex in pattern or decoration. The ways to glaze pottery is there's infinite ways to do it. And ceramics have been traditionally also used for sculpture. You can see here this Robert Arneson sculpture is formed with clay, and then it's a portrait sculpture of Jackson Pollock. So the artist chose a surface decoration that kind of matched the style of the artist it depicts, with splattering paint all over it instead of doing a traditional just kind of flat color glaze. There's different types of clay, and they're classified by their clay composition and the temperature that they're fired at. So in the world of clay, the temperatures correspond with pyrometric cones. So low fire temperatures, earthenware and terracotta, fire somewhere between cone 09 and 01. We've got mid-fire temperatures called stoneware that fires anywhere from cone 1 to cone 6, and then high fire temperatures, stoneware and porcelains fire from cone 7 to 10. And you can look at the Fahrenheit temperature for cone 10 goes all the way up to 2,345 degrees. So it gets a lot hotter than your basic oven at your house. So earthenware is pottery made from slightly porous clay that has been fired at relatively low kiln temperatures. Terracotta is also a low fire clay, but it's a little bit higher temperature than earthenware, and it is usually a reddish color clay that has iron in it, which gives it a reddish or brownish look. And so on the left-hand side, we have a relief sculpture made with terracotta clay, and on the right-hand side is glazed earthenware pottery. This is an example of stoneware. It is a sculpture, just titled block number 43. It's usually, the clay is usually gray or brown. It has some more impurities in it, just things from the earth that the clay has collected as it's traveled and settled into the earth. And then the most, I guess, highest fire clay body is called porcelain. It is usually white or very light gray in color. It's made from minerals such as feldspar, quartz, and flint. It's usually fired to a pretty high temperature, 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's usually its maximum temperature. If you can imagine trying to sculpt something or work with a block of cream cheese, that's sometimes what porcelain feels like. It's very, very silky and smooth, but it can be very frustrating as well. Okay, let's move on and talk about glass. Glass is generally made from molten sand or silica mixed with minerals such as lead, potash, soda, and lime. And rich hues in glass result from adding metal oxides with distinct color properties to the molten silica. Glass blowing was something that was developed by the ancient Romans, and it enabled the creation of glass vessels of all shapes, sizes, functions, and colors. And I'm just going to play a short little piece of this video just so you can see glass blowing if you have never seen it before, have no idea how it's done. It's really a fascinating procedure. Okay, during the Middle Ages, stained glass windows achieved their peak of perfection in French and German cathedrals. So, this is another way that glass was incorporated into windows, and being able to tell stories through images was through stained glass windows. And in the 19th century, Louis Comfort Tiffany Studios produced vases and stained glass windows inspired by ancient glassware and medieval stained glass. You might have heard of Tiffany Glass before, very, very famous company that produced anything from lamps with Tiffany glass, very bright, intense colors, a lot of nature scenes, but certainly one of the more well-known glass studios. And Dale Chihuly was an artist who is famous for his glass installations. He's known for making these really beautiful chandeliers of these pieces that are sometimes installed in public spaces, gardens, things like that. He had a whole team of people that helped him make the pieces and assemble the pieces. They seem to kind of defy just like the laws of gravity, and just the idea of like, wow, how can you get all those connected together without things breaking? Just really beautiful colors, and he tries to look at the environment in which they're going to be installed. So very much site-specific kind of installations to kind of mesh well with their environments. Okay, let's move on and talk about textile arts. Textile arts are arts and crafts in which fibers are used to make functional and decorative objects or works of art. Fibers are slender thread-like structures that are derived from animals, for example, wool or silk, vegetable, cotton or linen, or synthetic, rayon, nylon, fiberglass sources. Fiber arts include weaving, embroidery, crochet, macrame. We'll look at some examples. So the textbook has this beautiful carpet that is used as an example of weaving, and just generally, if you don't know anything about weaving, it's done with kind of main structure is called the warp threads. So those are kind of like I describe it as kind of like the skeleton of the weaving, and then the weft threads are what go over, under, back and forth. And there's lots of different types of weaving. It can be done by hand, it can be done on a loom. Some of the looms are tabletop size, some looms can fill a room. There's just an enormous variety of types of weaving to achieve something as like a carpet, to blankets, to just wall tapestries that depict entire pictures. There are certain cultures that have valued textiles and weavings greatly. In ancient Peru, weavings and textiles were valued more than gold. So it's when the white European explorers came over and were like way more interested in the gold, and everybody else was like, but what about our weavings? They valued the weavings even more than gold, and were used as currency to honor the spirits, to send people into the afterlife. So textiles have been something very valued in cultures all throughout time. This is an example of a weaving done with more natural materials. So this was actually done with cedar bark. So the cedar bark is then wrapped with wool as well. So this is a combination of very natural materials. The area that the Native Americans come from, where this blanket was made, or this robe was made, the cedar trees are highly essential to their way of life. So even being incorporated into weavings. And here's another example of textiles as an art form. So using traditional craft materials to make these forms. Fern Jacobs uses a coiling method. So it's kind of a thicker piece of coil that is then wrapped with thread to get the coils. And so then it's kind of laid into positions and wrapped to help it take its form. So it's maybe traditional craft materials, but not necessarily a functional object. It's definitely more of an artistic sculpture. Surfaces of fabrics can be enhanced by printing, embroidery, tie-dyeing, or batik. I've shown a couple examples of printing. You can see the left-hand side, that is a relief print, which you have learned about. The center one is something called shibori dyeing, which is a kind of a similar form of tie-dyeing, where the fabric is tied into pieces and sewn to hold in position and then dyed into, dipped into dye to create interesting patterns. And then the batik is on the right, and that is where hot wax is drawn onto fabric to prevent dye from adhering to those places where the wax are. And then the fabric is dipped into dye, and then the wax is then melted off. And so you have contrast between the colors of the dye versus the original color of the fabric. In basket weaving or basketry, animal or vegetable fibers such as twigs, grasses, straw, or animal hair are woven into baskets or other containers. As with other crafts, baskets making crosses, time periods, and cultures. The example here from the Pomo people, these are some of the most amazing basket makers throughout human history. This particular basket was a ceremonial piece. It was not necessarily meant to be used as an everyday object, but it was given on a special occasion, and you can see that it has intricate weaving onto it, but then also other decorative items attached to it. Metalwork and jewelry. So we've talked about metal so far with sculpture, and now we're talking about it in terms of jewelry and smaller size objects. The process of refining and working with metals is called metalwork, and that's a word that encompasses a range of diverse objects and projects from the industrial world to the jeweler's workshop. Iron, stainless steel, aluminum, and bronze are used for functional items and in works of art. Silver and gold have been prized for millennia for their rarity and their appealing colors and textures. In jewelry, these precious metals often serve as settings for equally precious gems or polished stones, and their surfaces can be enameled by melting powdered glass on them. Metal can be hammered into shape, embossed with raised designs, and cast according to some of those procedures that we talked about earlier. Each form of working with metal has its own tradition and its advantages and disadvantages. This is a pectoral piece. It was designed to be placed on the chest of someone who has passed away, so a burial piece. And you can see that it has some just very beautiful, intricate designs on it, as well as some sculptural, figurative imagery as well. This is an example of a functional object. It's a salt cellar, and meaning it was designed to hold salt for the table, so someone could use it to scoop salt out for their food. And this is a gold object that would have been cast similarly in the similar processes that lost wax casting process that we saw earlier. And then it has enamel on it as well, so that's colored glass that's been melted onto the surface to give it some color. And this is a nose ornament made from gold, silver, and turquoise, and the turquoise is inlaid into the eyes of the crayfish. I do not know exactly how this would have been worn, but it is an example of jewelry, and certainly when we think about metalwork, we can associate that with jewelry and fashioning ways to beautify the human body. And here is an example of metalwork in a more sculptural form. This piece is a cart that also has sterling silver on it, aluminum, gauze, mesh, tape, tubing, and pearls. It was specifically made as a piece to comment on the AIDS epidemic, so it is more of an art piece, but certainly fashioned with traditional metalworking techniques. And moving into talking about wood. Some relatively sophisticated technology is required to convert glass, metal, and clay into something of use. Wood, however, only has to get cut and carved to form functional objects. So in this example, we've got a vase form that has been carved from wood. And another David Ellsworth vessel that you can see has been highly polished. So it contrasts well with the chair that you see on the right-hand side, where we have the vessel highly polished, very smooth surface of wood, versus the chair, which kind of shows off the texture of wood and the idea of like all the individual little pieces kind of coming together, being constructed into a chair form. Okay, and this is going to end the lecture on craft arts.